everybody. Is that working? Yes, it is. Everyone's being very quiet. I want to start the proceedings by inviting Naomi Wolfe to do an acknowledgement of country for us.
Morning, everyone. My name's Naomi. I'm a Trawlway woman. We do have elders coming to give us a welcome to country tonight. So we will hear from traditional owners tonight, but it is ACU policy and practice and our privilege to acknowledge the traditional owners wherever we're gathered. So as an Aboriginal academic at ACU, it's my privilege to acknowledge the Cammeraygal Gurindji people of the land, acknowledge their ancestors past, present and future, thank them for their hospitality. Thank them for the beautiful rains that we've had today, the sunshine and the rainbows that are coming, and the welcome that we receive. I would also like to acknowledge and pay our respects to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people gathered. We acknowledge your ancestors past, present and future. We acknowledge our First Nations and World Indigenous mob from around the world. Thank you for travelling the seas and the skies to be with us, mob. And in the spirit of reconciliation, renewal of relationship, perhaps new relationship, we acknowledge the non-Indigenous ancestry in the room and pay our respects to ancestors past, present and future. In many societies, including my own, we have a view that our ancestral songlines connect us. And we believe today that our ancestral songlines have connected us on Gurindji country, Guringai country, sorry. So let us remember the ancestors and walk with them as we journey in our conference.
Thank you, Naomi. For those who don't know me or didn't meet me doing frantic things on the reception desk, I'm Shurlee Swain, and I'm playing multiple roles today. We're all kind of double dipping here. And my first role in this session is to welcome you on behalf of ACU. We are so delighted that you made the trip to join us, and we hope you enjoy our facilities, and we hope the rain holds off long enough for people not to drown between getting from here to shopping that house. Or however you pronounce that strange name, they trained me to do that. Well, again, as Naomi said, we're having a formal welcome this evening, and you'll hear more about how delighted we are to have you here then. But right now, we want to kind of move straight into this session, our first plenary session, which is about Imagine Futures for Adopted Children. So we have four speakers. I'll start by setting up the propositions, then Professor Joy Damousi will talk about some of her work in relation to adoption. Then Naomi Wolfe will talk about her work, about the impact of adoption for Indigenous communities in Australia. And then finally, Lynelle Long, an inter-country adoptee, will talk about that aspect of adoption. We're hoping to be very slick, and we have Chris positioned there in the front row to kind of shoot us down. And if she does that well, we should have time for questions afterwards, and then Nell will do brief housekeeping before we move to the first session. So this roundtable was inspired by Australia's most recent inquiry into adoption, which was a small one in the House of Representatives. In its report, it dismissed the relevance of history and said that was in the past and they wanted to look forward, and came up with a series of recommendations that talked about, again, the kind of happy ever after narrative of adoption, talked about children languishing in care and said we could get them all into happy family homes. There was a minority report that said, wait a minute, but they were largely in relation to Indigenous families. They thought it might break Indigenous families. But generally, the message was happy ever after. Luckily, the person who organised that left the party in the ructions of last year and nothing ever happened with that report, but it's still there. What's the attraction of adoption? Well, firstly, it promises to reopen the supply of children for adoption to prospective adoptive parents, and that's been sadly lacking in Australia. Secondly, government always hopes that if you introduce adoption, you'll reduce the costs of providing out-of-home care. And thirdly, it is the promise that children will have a permanent home instead of being shoved through the system. But if we look back to history, we know that all of those attractions are problematic. The children who enter the care system are rarely the ones that prospective parents want. And the permanent home just is not likely to eventuate. More problematically, if it does eventuate, it leaves the child without the protection of ongoing supervision, and it leaves the adoptive parents without support, unless they go and say, we're having problems and really scream for it. Basically, it's assumed it's happy ever after, you don't need it. But it hasn't been like that. This is Thomas Graham, an adoptee who's quite openly very thankful for his adopted home, but talking about what it was like to be adopted under those circumstances, where you had to be grateful. You'd been chosen, you had to be grateful, and love was going to conquer all. In academic circles, the questioning of the happy ever after narrative is widespread. After the big Australian inquiry into forced adoption, the Institute of Family Studies did a phone-in and questionnaire for people, and they received quite a lot of comments from adoptive parents who were disillusioned by what they'd heard in the course of the inquiry. They heard from adoptees whose placements had failed, and they heard from adopted parents who said, really, we weren't told what we were going to face. Most of them had made it through, but we weren't told it was going to be tricky, that it wasn't like your very own child. The dis-ease around adoption is not confined to Australia. A 2018 review by the British Association of Social Workers of the pro-adoption policies in play at the moment in England talked about the unhelpful silencing of adopted children and adults who have to manage their feelings of grief and loss as against the idea that they're meant to be grateful and thankful. There have been similar kind of stirrings in the United States. So given such disquiet, how can we as historians explain the persistence of the happy ever after narrative? I decided to have a little play in Trove, which, for those of you who are not Australian, is our big online historical newspaper database and can occupy too much of your time. But I thought what I'd look for was literary representations of adoption in short stories and the like and serials that were published. I found 206 in the period from the mid-19th century to 1974 actually, because the Women's Weekly goes to 74. Mostly they were romance, but there was also a strong line in mystery and adventure. Agatha Christie, I discovered, loved adoption as a plot twist to disturb the family. So there were lots of Agatha Christie ones there. They're mostly British stories in the 19th century. You get American ones coming in and the occasional Australian one, including the Australian children's author Ethel Turner, who had several stories around adoption. What's interesting about the stories is the way they both reflect, but also to some extent construct contemporary adoption practice. If we look in the 19th century, the adoptees were overwhelmingly orphans, so you don't have to worry about that embarrassing family you're destroying, more likely to be female than male. The most common adopters, and this was the big surprise, were single males who were able to provide them with economic security. And the core relevance of adoption to the plot was the way in which it complicated patterns of inheritance, which were often resolved through romance. Either the adoptee who'd been disinherited found a nice young man to marry her, or the family member who'd been disinherited by the adoptee married her. Sometimes the single adopter married her, which I found a little disturbing. In the first half of the 20th century, orphaned and abandoned children still predominated. Slightly more females than males now, but it's evening up. The range of adopters extended to include married couples and a small number of single women. Issues around inheritance are still pretty big there, but this is where we get the rescue narrative coming in and the idea that adoption was a way of building a family. And it's interesting that they're exactly the things that are encoded into the Australian adoption legislation that's introduced in the first half of the 20th century. What I was interested in, though, was that the notion of the adoptee as a taint, a potential taint in the family, was largely not explored. Yet, in terms of introducing the legislation, that was the big propaganda effort that people tried to get out there, that this child will not taint your family. It's not hereditary, it's environment. You can cure them. And it's not being picked up in the stories. In the third era, adoptees were equally divided between the genders. And for the first time, we have ex-nuptial children coming in there as the focus of adoption, with orphans still there. Married couples predominated at this stage, with a small group of single women for whom the plot suggested that an adopted child was kind of a compensation for not having married and being lonely. Although sometimes, by taking in the child, they must soften themselves because a gallant young man comes to mend the electricity or something and falls in love with them. In these stories, adoption was primarily presented as a way of building family, with adoption as rescue coming a close second. And again, these are themes that very closely reflect the promotional literature of the time. Interestingly, however, the possibility of an adopted child as a taint to the family is huge. It appears there just when all the propaganda should have said that it was thoroughly gone. I suspect that's a reaction against the determination of contemporary adoption advocates to completely downplay that possibility. Also apparent is a rising interest in issues around relinquishment, which I thought interesting to see there, but then when you read on with the story, you can see my brain became quite polluted with this exercise. When you read on with the story, the relinquishment is only there in order to focus on the necessity and selflessness of relinquishment. There's no suggestion that you shouldn't relinquish, rather it's to reaffirm that in relinquishing you're doing the best thing to your child. However, it is perhaps the silences that best explain the persistence of the happy ever after narrative. By unduly focusing on orphaned or abandoned children, the awkward issues around relinquishment can be largely avoided, nor are the views of the potential adoptees much canvassed. Although there are occasional stories when children in institutions are actively looking for a potential adopter, including writing pleading letters as the kind of basis of the story, more usually they appear as helpless subjects who should be grateful for their good fortune. And it's always a good fortune, except in the taint ones, and all the rest of them, everybody goes on to live happily ever after so quickly it warms your heart. Implicit in the stories are assumptions about what renders a child acceptable or even desirable to adoptive parents. They're almost exclusively white, including a subgenre of white children found in various places with non-white guardians on Pacific Islands, in Aboriginal communities, amongst the Chinese. All of that's very strongly there. And what I'm suggesting in setting up the conversation for the rest of it, this session, is that by highlighting these silences and exclusions, history can contribute to contemporary debates around adoption by challenging the happy ever after narrative. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just grab some water. So my talk flows on very nicely from Shurlee's introductory comments, because I'm looking at the topic of adopted children and war and inter-country and transnational adoption in the context of the wars of the 20th century. So, here we are. I want to make 3 points today, and the first one is around the construction of inter-country adoption and child war refugees in terms of 20th century humanitarianism. So this notion that inter-country adoption and adoption of child refugees is very much framed as an idealised humanitarian act, premised very much on the construction of a fantasised future for refugee children. Now, this is a very strong theme that permeates the 20th century throughout all the wars. So I'm just going to pause for a moment, talk a little bit about my work, and up here I've put 2 examples of at different ends of the 20th century. I don't expect you to be able to read the print of the Trove reference. Thanks, Shurlee. The heading there is War Orphans for Australia, and that comes from during the First World War. And it's a campaign by Dr. Richard Arthur, a medical doctor who in New South Wales was very active in trying to orchestrate war orphan adoptions from Europe to Australia. That dates from about 1916 right to 1968, and you can see that letter there from someone who writes to the Australian Council of Overseas Aid about the possibility of adopting a Vietnamese orphan by Australian parents, and her expressed desire that it's a practical way there to do something for the refugee children. So my current work looks at children affected by war and its aftermaths. It takes as its starting point the humanitarian campaigns that were undertaken in relation to war children. The predicament of the vulnerable, abandoned, impoverished child from circumstances of war has throughout the 20th century elicited a deeply emotional response from across the Australian community over this time. From child survivors of the Armenian genocide to child refugees from the First World War, children of the Russian famine in the 1920s, to orphan children from the Spanish and Greek civil wars, to Jewish children of the Holocaust and Vietnam War orphans, Australians have responded mainly through fundraising and letter writing campaigns to pressure governments to allow adoption. framed within contemporary understandings of empathy and compassion to national, international and humanitarian efforts to assist children affected by war. Underpinning these campaigns has been an understanding of humanitarianism, defined very much and informed by an imagined, fantasised future of happiness for such war refugee children. And what I want to argue here is these campaigns of inter-country and transnational adoption of war refugees have been marked by a series of characteristics. First of all, there is this notion that what can be attained by adoption is an idealised, untainted childhood which has been destroyed by war, but which can somehow be retrieved and reconstructed through adoption. And that's quite a strong narrative, that the aspiration of people like that, the woman who's written in 1968, that their efforts can reconstruct and reinvent a new childhood for these children who have lost their childhood in war. So that's the first sort of point I want to raise here in this narrative. The second is that adoptees are constructed and construct themselves as saviours and heroes, often retrieving innocent children as they see it and providing a narrative of uncomplicated, happy resolution, speaking and acting on behalf of children. And the point that interests me here is the emergence of a conflation of individual motives with altruism. That individual motives, such as the one expressed here in this letter, then become constructed as altruistic. Thirdly, I want to just raise this question that here in this sort of type of narrative of humanitarianism is the construction of a social imaginary linked to the perpetuation of an idealised family model and idealised parenthood. And I think it is important to note here in this context that while this was the predominant sort of narrative throughout the 20th century, there were always strong contestations to this narrative and questions about whether adoption was in fact best for the war refugee child, or removing children at all from their cultures was appropriate, or from other family members. So this counter-narrative has, I think it's important to recognise, been prevalent throughout and continue to contest this happy narrative. So the second point I want to raise now is to pick up on this narrative through a concrete example in the context of the Japanese Australian children born to Australian military personnel and Japanese mothers between 1946 and 1956, when Australian servicemen were stationed in Japan as part of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force and British Combined Forces in Korea. So as these three quotes, and there are hundreds of these letters that were written to Menzies demanding that children be made available for adoption during the early 1960s, as they suggest, there was a huge outcry in the Australian community to quote-unquote save these children through inter-country adoption. The distinctive aspect of this example, though, in the Japanese Australian children, is a cry, is underpinned, I think, by an investment in whiteness and white Australia. These were Australian children. It was the government's responsibility to bring them, quote-unquote, home. And many of the letters that were written to the government, like the ones up here, were stressed that adoption was an option, should be made an option, and was the most humanitarian of responses. That was the word they used, especially because the fathers of Japanese Australian children were white Australians. So in the three examples I've selected here out of the hundreds of letters that are in the archive, the first is written in October 1962 by the Anglican Diocese of Melbourne, writing to Menzies, expressing the view that the Synod was moved by the plight of children of Australian servicemen and strongly urging the government to expect responsibility for the welfare of these children and to permit as many as desired to do so to be brought to Australia for adoption to affect their well-being. Second letter is a direct appeal, and there are many of these appeals by individuals, by Australian individuals, not always women, but typically, seeking a child of their own, and this became very prevalent in the material as well, in the letters. And the third example is an interesting one because it compares the US with the Australian situation, where we know there was quite a big program of adoption in the US And in this letter, there is an appeal to Christianity, an appeal to getting a chance of happiness, and this question coming back to happiness and giving children happiness. So that just gives you a sort of taste of the type of tone and, in fact, anger about the fact that the government had not put in place an adoption program for these children to come to Australia to be adopted by Australian citizens. But this transnational adoption in this case soon became an issue about race, but it also became an issue about immigration and about foreign aid and where the interests of the child best lay. In immigrating to Australia through adoption or in remaining with their communities, the children's communities in Japan, where the Australian government would provide foreign aid. Now, this is an interesting example where the government actually argued against this position of adoption, saying it was better to keep children in the communities they were in Japan and provide foreign aid. And that's in fact what they did right throughout the 1960s to the children who were born to Australian servicemen. Both of these positions, however, were premised on narratives of the imagined happiness of children and, in fact, the saviour narrative. It became a hotly contested narrative. On the one hand, parents valorised in the process of adoption, and on the other, in the state and governments could absolve the guilt as well of what Australian servicemen had done, and as well as upholding the White Australia policy. What's distinctive about some of the letters that I came across in this case was the fact that many of the individuals were arguing for a relaxation of the White Australia policy to allow the children to come in. So it's an interesting paradox. And on the one hand, they're arguing for a position of, a fantasised childhood, and on the other saying that that is a humanitarian response, but that the White Australia policy should also be challenged. So there's a whole sort of several layers of discourse going on in this particular example. Okay, so the third point I want to raise here is a slightly different take on the notion of adoption, and it's one that I think is understudied in many of the literature on adoption, because it's not sort of physical adoption, it's financial adoption. So this particular example looks at child sponsorship as a form of financial adoption. So the impossibility of adoption of war refugees did not deter child rescue organisations from pursuing these issues, but it gave rise to a new form of the concept of adoption, and that is sponsorship and financial adoption, which became increasingly popular in the 1960s and 70s in Asian countries, but it predates this period and really began in earnest in the 1930s during the Spanish Civil War. And during the Spanish Civil War, you can see there was a campaign to promote financial adoption in Australia, where individuals could financially adopt a child, an orphan, in Spain. And there were sustained campaigns amongst children and schools for this to take place. As the 20th century moved on, as we know, organisations like World Vision took this up in a big way, and the Foster Parents Plan organisation also developed this notion of financial, adoption. So what I want to argue about this type of narrative, though, is that the imagined world of childhood, again, is displaced onto children in a form which is incredibly emotional, and it was promoted as an intimate, and is promoted, the system continues, as an intimate bond between the adoptee and the child. And this is a sort of new form of 20th century, 21st century humanitarianism, or constructed as such. So the emotional bond between the financially adopted child and parent is promoted in the same way, in some ways, to real adoptions, playing on imagined fantasy of child rescue and as well as promoting political messages. Perhaps the best known of this sort of child sponsorship as financial adoption is Eleanor Roosevelt's sponsorship of a number of war child refugees during World War II, whose letters very clearly point to how America is constructed as the saviour of the world. But it's not just about how America will win the war in these letters. This is the imaginary. What comes out very strongly is a sense of the notion of a family stability and security that Roosevelt is trying to promote through this adoption. And the children write to her identifying America as the paradigm of this sort of promoter of family security and stability. So there's always a political underpinning to these sorts of narratives. So just to sum up some of these points, in the transnational adoption of child refugees, I think we can see a humanitarianism during the 20th century which was based on a social imaginary of a fantasised and idealised childhood where prospective parents are constructed as heroes in a process where the individual motives become conflated with altruism. And the example of Australian Japanese children, we see that there's a rescuing of white children, so race, immigration and foreign aid merge together. This example, I think, sheets home how the construction of a war orphan is never an apolitical practice. It is always infused with a sentimentality and a politics. And finally, the intimacy and emotional bonds fostered by child sponsorship programs, I think, play into saviour fantasies and happiness narratives which invariably and ultimately depoliticise the circumstances of violence and war and instead aim to attain or retrieve a former and lost idealised childhood through their sponsorship. Thank you very much.
Take your time. My apologies, I don't have any slides. I've just been home. Oh, is there? Oh gosh, no one answers that. Oh, jeez. What time's the next flight? Adoptions for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and Indigenous communities right around the world, and I'm speaking about adoption outside of our communities because we, in Indigenous communities, we may not call it adoption, but we look after the children in our communities because we have a different kinship structure. So it's, in our communities, we have the mechanisms already to look after children in our communities. So I particularly want to respond with the notion of adoption outside of our communities. And perhaps I'll start with the story of a countrywoman, Mathena, and many of you may have gone to the Bangarra Dance Theatre who put on a production about the life of Mathena, who was a young Tasmanian Aboriginal woman who is separated from her family. And the story is quite sad. She has an older sister who is used as a political pawn by a missionary, George Augustus Robinson, who, because Mathena's parents were holding out against his black line, were refusing to go to the mission he was establishing, Wyballina on Flinders Island, he steals their eldest daughter and keeps her to manoeuvre them, to force them into giving up their freedom fighting techniques and to move to Flinders Island. He never returns her. He sends her instead to St John's Orphanage in Hobart. Mathena is born at Wyballina, and when she's about 3, 4, 5, we don't know, young, she takes the attention of Sir John and Lady Jane Franklin, who decide to adopt her and take her away. And they take her to Hobart, where she lives alongside their daughter Eleanor, receiving governess training, and becomes quite the kind of black princess of Hobart. She is isolated from her community, who are the remnants taken to Flinders Island, and she's isolated from country, she's isolated from family, and she's in this unusual public space. When the Franklins are called back to England, they don't take Mathena with them. There's no reasons given for that. So she ends up at St John's Orphanage, where the older sister that she'd never met had died. She's not returned to her parents and her family and their countrymen at Wyballina. She eventually returns to Flinders Island as a teenager, but the connections were difficult for her. But she's not returned to her family. She lives in the house of the preacher alongside another elder of ours, Fanny Cochrane Smith, and she's treated terribly. She's never allowed to live with her family again, and unfortunately, she ends up drowning before her 18th birthday. If you read the Stolen Generations reports, if you listen to the stories of our elders and families, you'll know that many of our children throughout generations, throughout all of the states and territories, have been removed, adopted out into families. Some of those families had no idea that they were adopting Aboriginal children. A friend of mine was adopted into a family. Her adoptive family already had several children, but they read in a local Catholic newspaper in Melbourne that good families were required. Answer God's call. Give these children, these unloved, unwanted, unwashed children, a loving family. And so they did. And when they adopted my friend, her adoptive parents asked, "What background is our daughter?" And the nuns replied, "Greek, Italian, Mediterranean, but with enough Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Celtic that she'll eventually grow out of any strange ideas." I talked to, and I have Anne-Marie's permission to speak about this. When I talked to Anne-Marie's parents when they were still alive, they said something was very off about that story. And they thought, we think our daughter might be, in their words, part Aboriginal. And so they encouraged Anne-Marie when she was old enough to apply for her file. And they supported her in that journey because they wanted her to know that she was fully loved by them, but that she needed, and she had a yearning to find out who she was. And there, quite clearly in the file, it talks about her being a part Aboriginal child. No mention of Greek ancestry, no mention of Italian ancestry. At the same time, in the 1960s, another good friend of mine, Shari, is part of the 60s scoop. She is taken from her parents. She does not remember her parents. She was 2. Her dad comes home to find his wife, and the older children have returned from school and the family is in complete trauma. She's raised in a residential school, believing that her family did not want her, did not love her. She's adopted into a good family who are also told that the family abandoned her, that they too were answering the call, the good Christian call, to give this native child a loving home. It's been decades of reconnecting and finding her family. We know that the Sami people in Scandinavia have similar stories. We know that's happening to New Zealand kids, Maori and other Indigenous communities around the world. So adoption has not been great for us. And it goes hand in hand often with religion. And the element of race is there as well. In 1991, because of family issues, I was sent away to spend some time with one of my mother's friends. Dad was Aboriginal, he's just recently passed away, and Mum, who's also passed away, was non-Aboriginal. And she was worried I was getting into some misbehaving. So she sent me to go and stay in Alice Springs with a social worker friend of hers. Fun times. Very hot in Alice Springs for a Tassie girl. No offence to you warm country people, but... So my friend was the social worker at St Mary's Children's Village, which at that time had already had a long history, but was a place for disabled Aboriginal children. And when I arrived there, the head worker said, "Oh, you're the half-caste girl." Okay, I wasn't really sure what that meant. It wasn't a term I was that familiar with. And she said, "Well, you're good with kids, let's put you here." And the children were delightful, absolutely amazing. And we got to go in the pool. But on Sunday, something peculiar happened. I was told, now, in this area here, which was a grassed area, you'll begin to see a lot of those people arriving. I'm thinking, what are those people? I'm thinking, what's the those community? I'm thinking it's some strange word. No, it was the Aboriginal parents of the children that were being cared for at St Mary's. Now, I'd been told that these children had been abandoned by their Aboriginal parents because they were disabled, that no one was going to care for them, that they were randomly left in the bush, and that no one would adopt these children because they were high needs. And yet on Sunday, from when the sun rose, there was a big mob of men and women. And they weren't allowed inside the house. They had the children, some of them in wheelchairs, were taken outside, and they were allowed 2 hours with their children, but they stayed all day. And the head worker said to me, "If they don't go, we just call the police." But yet these are children who did not want, whose parents did not want them, and yet they were here every Sunday. They knew not to come any other day, just Sundays for 2 hours. 2007, we find the Northern Territory intervention happening, and again there is a flurry. Won't people think of the children? And there was an email that came around that said from a good Christian man, we should think about removing those children and giving them good homes. That person had not read the Little Children a Sacred Report, had not understood the gravity of what he was suggesting, had not understood that the racism that underpinned that intervention, that still continues to underpin that intervention. 2016, I get an email from an elder who was also given an email from a couple who had been fostering 2 Aboriginal children in WA, and they'd moved to Queensland, and they were emailing everyone that they knew that might be Aboriginal to help them, decide whether they should adopt or not adopt these children. Should we adopt them? What are the problems? Who's encountered things? And I'll just end with one thing. 2018, in this state last year, a law was passed to allow the state government to adopt children without parental consent. So if children are in the foster care system, then no parental consent is needed for them to be adopted. No consultation with communities. Now, that affects non-Indigenous children, but almost 40% of children in foster care in New South Wales are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So it directly affects our communities. And it is part of the continuing colonial project. It is part of assimilation. Adoptive parents are not given very little training, and our communities are not consulted. And so what we have is what people will talk about flippantly, but for us, it's very personal. So for us, the continuing legacies of colonial adoption exist and modern day. So we don't need advocates at the moment, we need allies that challenge the system. And that's you, and that's me. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much, Shurlee, for having me today. I'm very honoured and privileged to be here. My name's Lynelle Long. I'm not an academic, so I'm a person who actually is from lived experience. I am here because I want to talk to you as a representation of those with the lived experience of intercountry adoption. I want you just to place yourself in a small way in my shoes just for 1 minute. I know I've only got 10, so I'm taking a risk, but I think it's really important for you all to feel what this is about rather than just hear and logically think about what it is. So for a minute, I just want you to turn around, have a look at the person behind you and think for a minute, if I was to say to you, you are now going to be their kin, you are now no longer who you are, but you're actually related to the person behind you. What would you think? How would you feel? What does it mean? And I want to propose to you that this is what happens to people like me. We get placed with a complete stranger, and racially they're usually very different. So I notice in our audience today, we're not too diverse. But imagine if everyone behind you was black, brown, yellow, how you would feel. So for me, in my life growing up, that is my experience. I've been raised in a completely white family. I look nothing like them. And that is actually my siblings. So you can see they have 4 children of their own. I was adopted in 1973 from Vietnam, out of the Vietnam War, highly contentious and very publicised. And of course, all of the families, including mine, were the ones who wrote those letters to the Prime Minister at the time, imploring, please let us help these children. You know, we can give them a better life. And yes, so I guess I want to just raise in your mind that that is the thinking of the time, and that still persists to this day in many, many ways, and around the world it's reflected. So I'm actually going to bring you, I guess, a bit of a snapshot of how it is for us actually living this. We are kind of like a bit of a social experiment back in the, you know, it started off in the 50s with the Greek adoptees. It began then with the Japanese going to other countries, not Australia, and then the Koreans, South Koreans en masse, and then the Vietnamese en masse. We have all grown up in countries around the world, Australia, America, Canada, Europe, everywhere. And if you take a moment to look at my website is a place and a portal where we bring each of those stories together as life experience to share with the world, to try and help educate the greater public about the real lived experience of intercountry adoptees, what it's really like to be uprooted, and whether it really has been a great experiment or not. So I'm going to talk to you today about some of the challenges that we actually live, and they're things that you don't necessarily read in academia because not a lot is written about it yet, and a lot of academics haven't actually caught up with where we're actually at. But I have founded a worldwide network, ICAV for short, Intercountry Adoptee Voices, and we share our life experiences and talk about the impacts. So when you turned around and had a look at the person behind you, you probably thought, who the hell are they, right? Okay, so that's pretty much the first thing we think when we grow up and get old enough to think critically about our adoptive families. Who the hell are they and how did I get placed here? And as we get older and older and we start to understand the politics of adoption around the world, that is the questioning that we have. How the hell did our government agree on this? Why did we get sent to this country and not some other? And when we meet each other over the internet, you know, the questions that we always have are around the concept of, you know, the matching that is so-called done. It is such a random lottery to actually place a child with some other family, not racially even looking like us, halfway around the world. I mean, when we get adopted, we're usually infants or very young children. We don't even have a known personality at that time, or likes or dislikes. And our adoptive family, well, they portray themselves however they wish to social workers, and you know, it's usually a few hours or many hours in Australia, but not necessarily around the world like America. So adoptive families can portray themselves a certain way. So the matching in our eyes is very, very random. It's pretty much as good as a lottery, and your chance of getting placed with a family that actually does match you well in terms of personality, likes, the way that you think, the way that you just are, is actually quite random. And it's, you know, I guess I haven't scientifically studied it, but, you know, there are a lot of us that actually feel like we're a square in a round hole, or the other way around, and that it's quite a mismatch many, many times. And so we grow up feeling very misplaced. And I want to just share with you a little bit about how that impacts us. So I was born in 1973. At that time, Australia and the world didn't have the UNCRC, the Child's Rights Charter, or the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption. So adoptions in that time, before Australia agreed to allow adoptive parents to bring children in en masse, we were done via private proxy adoptions. So that meant, for example, my father hired a lawyer in Vietnam who did all the paperwork, found a child, which was me, matched us up and transacted. Interestingly, my parents ended up paying money into a French bank account, and doing all sorts of interesting things. So my father actually flew to Vietnam, brought me home via Hong Kong, but lo and behold, my paperwork never actually turned up or existed. And to this day, 46 years later, I still have never seen my adoption paperwork from Vietnam. So these are you can imagine a lot of the questions I have had in my life surrounding my identity. Was I relinquished? Was it meant to be? You know, it's always there in the back of my mind. Do my parents actually know where, you know, what has happened to me? Was it their choice? And there are many, many of us in this type of situation. So in those days, yes, social workers told adoptive parents, love the child as your own and everything will work out. Well, hello, I'm here to attest to the fact that it's not exactly that straightforward and easy. My parents were not educated at the levels that adoptive parents get now, and they did the best they could. I am still very connected and close with my parents to a degree, but I do speak out openly, and of course for any adoptive family that would create a little bit of friction because, you know, you're kind of under a microscope and you're getting talked about. And I know that, you know, my adoptive parents, it's quite an uncomfortable feeling to be judged, I guess, you know, 40 years later after the event. But I guess most adoptive parents don't think about that. They don't think, oh my God, I'm going to get judged in 40 years' time under a microscope, to actually think about whether I've done the right thing or not. Was it ethical? Was it just? Could I have done something different? That thinking wasn't around back then, but it is now. So I began my exploration in my 20s to understand who I was and where I fit into this world. I grew up always knowing I was different because, of course, everybody publicly noticed and would comment, and so it was very hard to escape the reality. I grew up hating who I was and what I looked like and what I represented because I was very ashamed. And in that time in the 70s, we just came out of the White Australia policy. So, you know, Australia was still quite anti-Asian. I grew up in the country. I didn't, unfortunately, get adopted by Deborah Lee and Hugh Jackman or Madonna. Damn it. I'm still very upset about that. My life would have been completely different. But I am what I am, and I grew up on a dairy farm. So I grew up milking cows, not on the movie star Hollywood platform. But anyway, I grew up feeling quite ashamed of myself because I had no one around me to mirror me racially or to even talk to me about what it was to be a minority in a majority environment. And I certainly had nobody to validate or to empathise about my experience and what I might be feeling, or to even help me come up with the words for what I was experiencing. So I was that typical child who just absorbed everything that everyone told me. Adoption's wonderful. Aren't you so grateful? You're so lucky. Your parents are amazing. Well, yeah, you can kind of absorb that for a while until you start to feel a bit of a dissonance, you know, like a bit of an unharmonising kind of going on within. And I got to my mid-20s and definitely felt that and was in major suicide, major depression. And that's when I started to really explore, what is this dis-ease that I feel within me? And has my life been exactly how everyone's telling me? You know, am I just one of them? So it wasn't until I reached out and looked for fellow people like myself that I began to feel that there was somewhere that I could belong, somewhere that I could actually fit, where people got what I was talking about when I said, yes, my parents love me, but it's not the same. There's not that connection there. And so I've now met and created a platform and a network for people like me because, when I started in my mid-20s, there was nothing. There was no, adoptee peer group support. Nothing existed in Australia. I reached out to the Post-Adoption Resource Centre and they had a lot of white Australian adoptees, but no intercountry transracial adoptees. So I began that, and that is what ICAV is today. We are, one of the biggest, largest platforms in the world now. I want to tell you more excitedly about where we are now because that journey was really rough, as you can imagine, going through and trying to find the words. Books like The Primal Wound were absolutely critical because it finally gave me the words to the experience that I'd always lived but didn't quite, couldn't understand, because what happens is when you're a baby and you get separated from your mother, there is trauma that actually happens. We call it relinquishment trauma. And we are separated from the one person that we've known and are intimately tied to for 9 months in gestation. But yet when we get separated, if it is at birth, we have a lack of knowledge, we have a lack of words to put to that body experience. And so it's not until people like me read the books like The Primal Wound where we suddenly go, oh my God, this is the words to everything I've lived, but I just couldn't describe it. So that's why for many adoptees, when you talk to them, depending on where they are in their journey, most of them will tell you, like I did, yeah, I've had a great life, adoption's been wonderful. But that's because I just didn't have the words, I didn't have the knowledge, I didn't have the peer validation when I might say things like, but I was always teased even within my own family, or I was experiencing racism every day, but I just thought it was normal. Or I was singled out, but, nobody kind of said it was wrong. So, how we normalise things is quite interesting, and in adoption, it's very much that our whole experience in our adoptive world gets normalised, but a lot of the trauma and a lot of the unspoken things and experiences that we feel on a bodily perspective doesn't get translated to the logical cognitive until a later stage when we get to explore it. So today we actually are very much connecting, and the social media has been an amazing platform for facilitating that. Luckily for me, and probably the reason why ICAV has grown so big, is that I worked in IBM. So my background's technology as a professional, and I've built up a worldwide network through technology, and through the use of and harnessing technology, we have managed to very much bring adoptees together. And now we speak out globally and advocate to our governments about the challenges that we face. So on a worldwide scale, some of the worst issues that we face is, the lack of citizenship. In America, adoptees are fighting for their rights to be given citizenship. We just assume it comes. And from that, some adoptees get deported back to their birth countries. Can you imagine that? Getting sent back to a country you don't even have any memories of, you can't even speak the language. We have rehoming, we have abuse in adoptive families. It does exist and it's not talked about very often. But I can tell you, I have thousands of adoptees joining my network, and we have a significant proportion of children who grow up in abusive homes. We have mental health issues in adoptive families and for adoptees. So there's many adoptive families and parents who are not adequately screened to check for mental health issues. We have illicit practices in adoptions where children have been, put through adoption to make it look legitimate, but actually you've got to question how they came to be relinquished. Was it with full knowledge of what adoption is legally? We have lots and lots of issues that we face worldwide. So I guess the take-home message I want to leave with you as researchers and academics is to really challenge you to consider talking to those of us who have lived experience. There's nothing more powerful than hearing the real life experiences that can influence and help you to better understand at a cognitive level what is happening in a field. There is such an immense difference between thinking and rationalising compared to actually living it. and understanding the impacts on a social, an emotional, a material, a legal and a physical perspective. So one issue I just want to flag, for example, to highlight how difficult it is for us is if we have been illicitly adopted, where do we turn to for legal justice? There is no such thing in many, many cases. So we are left living with the mess of what has happened and having no recourse for justice. And perhaps it's time that we actually ask the question, is adoption in its current plenary form today a good solution, and should we be doing it? Because there is no doubt there are children around the world who are vulnerable and need care, but do we have to obliterate their original identity? Do we have to take away their culture, their heritage, their origins, the knowledge of who they are on a physical level? Should we take that away as a trade-off for giving them a good home, which is not always a good home? And I guess that's the question I'd like to leave you with. Thank you.
Who says we have a very short time for questions?
Probably about 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. Quick, short questions. So we have some questions from the
Can I? Sorry. I should have said we are recording this session, so if you have a question, your voice will be on the recording.
There's one.
Hi. There we go. I'm wondering if, and this is mostly for Shurlee and Joy, but it's for really anyone, if happiness is the key word that I picked up in your presentation, and are you able to historicize happiness over time? That's the one question. The second question is, are the single men who are taking in girls in the 19th century, the two largest, if I'm reading the chart correctly from Shurlee, are they taking them in as servants? And so those are the two questions. Had you interpret it that way? And then the comment is to sort of contextualize the questions is, I think about the pauper apprentices of British North America being a pursuit of happiness, but of course it's Jefferson's happiness. It's happiness of the fantasy of the independent household that they're contributing to, and it's tied to becoming useful and independent. And then I also think about in the trajectory of the placement of children, if you move forward to the other side of the 19th century to the early 20th century surge in foster care, again drawing on US examples, girls' economic value long outlives boys in this thing because of household service, because domestic labor continues to be of value, and it gets implicated in the foster care children, that is gendered female labor, much longer than it does for boys, and it preserves that notion of usefulness when happiness is becoming more of an internal state of mind rather than Jefferson's pursuit of happiness.
Perhaps I might start. You're right, happiness in the 19th century is economic security. But by the time we get the boom of adoption, no, it's emotional happiness. That's what's being promised. So they're not servants. They are actually they're imagined children, the imagined children that people could have had, which becomes bizarre when you start crossing racial boundaries. What do you want to buy?
Just quickly add the happiness issue around the parents who are pursuing these sort of campaigns is about their own happiness. It's really not about the children, it's about them. And that's why I think it's interesting to look at individual motive and how that becomes transformed into altruism. A very contested term.
Rosaria Franco, University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China. I have a more question, although there's no time to give some comments on this. I myself have researched transnational adoption, but from Hong Kong, and I linked very much to the Cold War and imperial history. So instead of commenting about your intervention. First of all, I want to say I'm deeply moved by seeing how politics actually has a consequence on people. And even the Vietnam adoptions had that political reasons. So maybe what I would ask to Professor Damousi, if you mentioned several times this political underpinning to many of these decisions about moving people around from the Second World War, by even the Jewish children before then. So I would like if you can give us a little bit a hint about these political decisions that were behind it, because there were big powers designed the life of kids and the political reasons.
So the question about the political agenda underpinning a lot of these campaigns, certainly, it depends which period you're looking at, but obviously post-45, does move into a Cold War context, and Australia's position in the Asia region in trying to stabilise the Asia-Pacific region after 45. It's very much seen as a way of the family connected to nation building, connected to preserving a Western paradigm of politics and family, and the family is the core, economic and emotional unit. And of course, in the context of Vietnam, the domino of, the sort of communist sort of prevalence in Asia, very much connected to the discourse about adoption. This was about stabilising the region as well, particularly in countries like Vietnam, which did go communist, obviously. So, it's a longer answer, but the Vietnam one is the best sort of short, quick example I can give you. Previous to that, the question of Spain and the Spanish Civil War, very much political there, and same with the Greek Civil War. The alignments are clear about the children that are coming and from what side of politics they're coming and why they should be supported. So, for example, quickly, the Greek Civil War, under a Labor government, there was support for communist children coming and children from communist backgrounds. Under a Conservative government, that program was ended immediately. Why would we give and support children from communist families coming to Australia? So it's very highly politicised. Thank you for the question.
We probably need to wrap up here.
One of the trade-offs of having these plenaries is
that they are only an hour, which feels very short when we've had such amazing people speaking. So please, let's thank everyone.